All right, today I'm going to talk about a question I get asked a lot, and that is, what is the best tide to target striped bass during? And this is a very good question and very interesting question because there's a common misconception that the best tide to target striped bass during is high tide. When there's the most volume of water in an area, people always believe, well, there has to be the most striped bass. There will be there during that tide because the water's deepest, the striped bass are going to be most likely to come closer to shore. And that can be the case, but it can be as equally the case that low tides in certain areas are far better for targeting these striped bass. Now, there's a few different scenarios where both come into play, but really the overarching answer to this question is, well, it's spot dependent. And that's what I always say to people. That's the thing. The tides are going to be a factor depending on where you're fishing. But when I'm looking at different structure that the striped bass can be in, there's different reasons for them to be there during a high tide versus a low tide. So for example, let's talk about a really good classic high tide spot that I fish a lot. And in this spot, it is in an estuary or a river system. And what happens is you have these big flood tides and they fill up into the marsh grasses. And what happens is there's shrimp and there's mud minnows and there's crabs all up and in the marsh grass. And during these big flood tides, it gives the striped bass the ability to not only feed on those crabs and shrimp and stuff that are in those or in the marsh grass, but on the outgoing tide, it sucks the mud minnows and the crabs and everything off of the sand, or off of the, not the sand flat, the marsh grasses and into the channel. And so the striped bass are feeding right along the channel edge, and there's a reason for them to be feeding at high tide. And in the same structure type, it being a river, there's more times in more places that actually produce better at low tides. And you'll be thinking to yourself, why is that? Well, that is because when it's not a huge tide, say you have like an 8-foot tide instead of a 10 or 11-foot tide in my area, and you have an 8-foot tide, so the marsh grasses are not going to get fully exposed. The only thing that's going to happen is the tide's going to come up. It's going to make more areas for the stripe, or more area in general for the striped bass to cover. And so what's going to happen is those fish are going to be spread out, and it's going to make it more difficult for you to figure out where those striped bass are staging up, and it's going to give less structure and less current lines for those striped bass to stage up in. Now, at low tide, when there's more exposed structure, it's going to narrow the channels in which the striped bass can be in. And that's going to narrow the places in which you can fish. It's going to give you more direct access to those deeper channels because there'll be less water leading up to the channel itself. And you'll be able to target those striped bass in much less space. And there'll be a lot more structure exposed, which will create more current lines. If you think about water draining out or even flooding into an area, if there's more structure that's exposed, the water is going to speed up as it's flooding around everything, and it's going to just create more current and more directions and everything like that. So you can use that to your advantage. So that right there is a great example of both why you'd fish at high tide and why you'd fish at low tide. So that should hopefully explain to most people, you know, when you're fishing in a spot, there has to be a reason for you to want to fish it at high tide, and there has to be a reason for you to want to fish it at a low tide. You just have to think of the reason why. And that's what I always tend to ask myself when I'm going to go out and fish. I always try to think of the reason why I'm fishing where I'm fishing. If I can't give myself a good reason to fish there, then I'm not going to be confident in catching. And that's really what it comes down to, and what took me a while to really get used to doing, which was gaining the confidence to go to an area and feel like I'm fishing it during the right time, during the right tide, and to feel like there's actually going to be bass there in the water, and I'm not just fishing into blank, dead water where there's gonna be no fish. And so that is a very important piece of fishing in general, and I feel like the question that everyone always asks, which is, when's the best tide to fish? That's really the broad answer to it. Well, the best time to fish is dependent on the spot. And even within one spot, there might be times where fishing at low tide's most beneficial, and then times where fishing at high tide's most beneficial. So there's a lot of different factors that lead into there being one answer and one outcome. And that's the wild thing, is there's always many factors leading to that one reason. Why would the striped bass be there? Why would the striped bass be feeding? And the thing that's always really tough, and that I always tell people, is you could do everything right. You could be fishing it at the right tide, the right time of year, and everything like that, and you might not catch anything. And so that's really the tough part about the fishery, and that's really the unfortunate part about striped bass fishing and that's what makes it so hard and difficult and rewarding in the same way. Because if you actually do end up catching a giant fish, you've definitely put your time and effort into it. And that, to me, that's like one good example. I mean, there's different examples of this. And another one is off the rocks where I fish on Cape Ann. I really like fishing low tides. And there are times that high tide is better, and there's more water that's in and further up the rocks. And I have spots that once enough water fills up into that area, the striped bass will come in really close to shore and feed, and it creates a perfect little area for them to feed. There's a great current line or some structure type that's going to make those fish want to hang out in there. But at low tides, what happens is more structure is exposed, and when the water is either flooding, as I was talking about before, or draining out in an area, and you have waves coming in and crashing onto the structure and sweeping out over the top of these rocks, what's happening is all the crabs and the lobsters and the bait fish that are up in those rocks are going to get disturbed by the waves crashing on them. They're going to get sucked out through these narrow channels that are now exposed all the way up to the surface, and it's going to make a perfect little ambush point for those striped bass to sit in. So a lot of the time you'll see tons of white water in the rocks, and you're bringing your plug back through this white water, and boom, you're onto a fish. And you're like, wow, it can't be more than 5 feet deep there, and yet there's a striped bass sitting in that. And the water that's going through there is all white water and waves and all sorts of crazy stuff that you could never even imagine a striped bass to be sitting in. Well, they're built for that, and they know that they're purpose built for. What I'm trying to say is they're purpose built for that, and they know that they can sit in the structure, in those crazy water, in white water and foam and current and all sorts of stuff like that, way better and way easier than any bait fish could. So when that bait goes flooding right by them, boom, they hit it. And that's when you can fish basically anything for them, and they have such a short window to bite the plug that they're so eager to attack immediately, because if that bait fish gets past them, they've missed their opportunity. So that's where the striped bass are up there feeding, and they're feeding really aggressively. So hopefully that gives you all a good broad understanding of what to look for when looking for tides and why. And yeah, that's really the big broad scope of like understanding tides. And hopefully that next season when you're looking for what time to go fish and you're looking at the tides and the tide charts, you can run through quickly the different factors of why there should be a striped bass there, whether it's a big tide, it's a 10-foot tide, so maybe you want to go into the estuaries with a big flood tide, or that in the spot there's a lot of current sweeping through an area at high tide, so well, if I go there at high tide, there'll be enough water to hold some fish, but the water's going to be sweeping through this area, so the striped bass will be there feeding. Or at low tide, you can go and know that you're going to have a lot of structure exposed. There's going to be a lot of little guts and channels in the rocks, and a lot of good ambush points for those striped bass to come up close to shore and feed. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.